The Exorcist Believer. Oh boy. This is the latest scary movie classic IP taken by director David Gordon Green. You might know that name from the Halloween reboot trilogy that started back in 2018. That first movie was a lot of fun. Halloween Kills basically gives you exactly what it promises, and Halloween Ends was a big gigantic pile of dog shit. So now here he is giving you a legacy sequel to what I consider the greatest scary movie of all time. No pressure. Okay, so when little 13-year-old Angela and her friend Catherine show signs of demonic possession, that's right, there's two girls who are possessed in this. They go off into the woods and they go missing for 3 days and they come back not really having much memory of what happened. This unleashes a chain of events that forces Angela's single father Victor Fielding, played by Leslie Odom Jr., to confront the devil. He starts to grow terrified and desperate, so because this is a legacy sequel, he seeks out the great Ellen Burstyn, returning as Chris McNeil, the only person alive who's witnessed anything like it before. Okay, my friends, I am so fucking conflicted right now. Because let me start by saying this. I walked into this theater today, and I was the only person in this auditorium. I walked into this pretty much aware that I knew this movie was not going to be as good as the original Exorcist. And I reviewed that. My first annual Halloween special, I made sure that The Exorcist was one of those movies on that list. Because now, 50 years later, that original is still one of the scariest movies of all time, if not the scariest movie of all time. And you want to know how I know that? Even now, 50 years later, they will show that original Exorcist in movie theaters, and people are still running out of the auditorium for that one scene. Like, people are still scared shitless of The Exorcist. With the original being a masterpiece, I think it's unrealistic to think that Believer could have possibly been better than that. So I was hoping for at least a slightly good movie. And you know what? Sitting through the first half of this thing, I was really into it. I was blown away. I loved the choices that were made in the cinematography. I loved the creative framing of a lot of these shots. I adore the Exorcist score. That theme is one of my favorites of all time, and getting to hear that on the big screen loudspeakers is awesome to hear. I love the acting across the board. Leslie Odom Jr., my dude, Aaron Burr from Hamilton. He is great in this. The emotional range this character has, the choices Odom Jr. is making with this part. It's clear that I'm a big advocate for this guy. Please, don't forget about Leslie Odom Jr. after this. Give him more work. He is phenomenal. As are the rest of the supporting cast. And Dowd is in this movie from Hereditary. I think she's absolutely wonderful. And I think the two young girls that they got to be possessed in this, really great young performers. I think both of these girls' ceilings are so high. I love how creepy they are once they do become possessed. Their eyes and looking into their eyes, yeah, it's terrifying. And of course, because it's a legacy sequel, you have Ellen Burstyn in here returning as Chris McNeil. Very, very, very troubled character when we meet her in this. Her and Reagan have since become estranged. And my god, Ellen Burstyn came to play. Like, I felt so much for her character in the 10 minutes that we got of her. And for a legacy sequel, when you bring old classic characters like that back into the fold, like, you want to make sure you're at least invested in what they're doing. And yeah, I was invested in her story and her plight. But that kind of leads me into my big problem. I mentioned the first half of this movie being freaking unreal. The first half of this movie actually felt freaking terrifying. And you want to know why that is? It was so freaking grounded in reality. These are campaigns to search for missing children. Parents who go and watch this movie who have been through this situation, God forbid, it will definitely strike a chord. Putting up the flyers around the neighborhood, the search parties. It's unfortunate, but that happens in real life. And that's what made the original Exorcist so freaking unbelievable. This thing, like, the idea of a possessed girl seems so freaking out there. And I feel like I said this when I initially reviewed The Exorcist way back when I started this channel. But the idea of a possessed girl who has been infiltrated by the devil, yeah, I mean, that's pretty hard to suspend your disbelief with that idea. But what director William Friedkin did with that idea and the performance of young Linda Blair, like, it still sends shivers up and down your spine. Like, the way that Friedkin helms that original film, rest in peace, by the way, he was a master. Like, it felt so real. And the fact that there was all this family drama interwoven within that main crux of the narrative, that's what makes the original Exorcist so good. Better yet, that's what makes it so scary. Once Believer becomes an Exorcist sequel, like, all the fear is thrown out the window. Like, yeah, you can certainly sense that there's some ambition in here to strike fear in the audience. And if I've said it before, I'll say it a million more times when I talk about horror movies. Fear is subjective, y'all. Not everybody like me is gonna find this movie scary. But once the second half of this movie kicks off, like, there was so much that was crammed into this gigantic 2-hour runtime. Like, it was losing me. I'm not gonna lie. Like, I can still sense that there's a story there. I can still sense that there's a beginning, middle, and end. And, like, it was cohesive what was going on. But there was way too freaking much. Case in point, the exorcism sequence in the third act. Like, it's shot really well, and the aesthetic is so creepy, haunted house. I watched a matinee screening of this, so I can only imagine going in at 7 p.m. at night to watch this movie. It probably would have been a much creepier ambiance and a creepier experience. But there's supporting characters talking over one another. They have to cut in between all these people's reactions. There's over a half dozen people in this room with these two girls. And, like, it was too much. You know how many people were in the room with Reagan in the original Exorcist movie? Two guys in there throwing holy water on her, saying the power of Christ compels you. Like, unless you've been living under a rock and you haven't seen that original Exorcist movie, yeah, spoiler alert, it's 50 years old. But you would know that. This movie has way too freaking much going on. And if I could be serious for a moment as well, I'm a Christian man. So I should know what to expect going in with a lot of this dialogue. And that's not to say that the original Exorcist movie isn't preachy, but that's not the crux of what the original Exorcist was all about. Like, that movie definitely had its preachy moments. I'm not gonna sit here and deny that. But people like myself still herald that movie as a masterpiece. Because at its core, The Exorcist is a horror movie. It is a pure horror movie with a demonic possession of a little girl. And it's so grounded in reality with all this family drama interwoven into the mix. Like, the fear factor is what you remember that original Exorcist for. Believer, I felt like, was so freaking preachy, especially going towards the latter part of this movie. And I was sitting there listening to this, and I'm like, yeah, I get it. Okay. Like, I'm not sure people are going into this theater expecting a sermon, but that's kind of what you get. Like, it was just too freaking much, guys. Now, here's the thing. I cannot objectively sit here and call The Exorcist Believer one of the worst movies of the year, like a lot of my peers are claiming it to be. Because I'll be damned, that first half was so freaking phenomenal. Like, if they just centered it around these two missing girls and these two families who have very conflicting ideals and very conflicting beliefs, and the fact that there's so many search parties out there and they're not finding these girls, that's terrifying as hell. Just do that the entire time. Which brings me to director David Gordon Green. So, here's my thing about him. I respected what he did with that first Halloween movie that he put out. Halloween Kills was fun enough, and I respect his drive and I respect his ambition to be different, but I would so much appreciate if the next movie he does, like, just do a completely original IP. Like, you don't need to rely on the nostalgia factor much anymore. Because this guy has proven that he is a more than capable hand behind the camera. A lot of the framing, like I said, the cinematography in Believer, pretty freaking dope. But I just think, story-wise, I think if he wants to further his career even more, do something original. Because I think this first half, he was onto something. But then when The Exorcist has to be woven into the mix, yeah, it becomes way too freaking much. So phenomenal first half and an overly messy second half. I can't sit here and say this is one of the worst movies of all time. But I must reiterate, if you go into this theater believing, no pun intended, that this is going to be as good as the original, like, I think you should just put your belief somewhere else. I'm gonna give The Exorcist Believer a C. Definitely better than people are saying it is, but it's definitely not making it a good movie in my book. I don't know, guys. I'm so freaking conflicted on this. Let me know what you thought of The Exorcist Believer down in the comments section. And let me know, have you seen that original Exorcist in theaters? Were there people running out? Do you have stories from those screenings? There's loads that we can talk about over here, and then some, guys. I love discussing all new things in movies and entertainment. It's a great community over here, and y'all are invited to the party. So do consider subscribing and tap on that thumbs up as well if you want to see more. And stay tuned for more in the Halloween special especially. I'm gonna be reviewing The Ring. I'll also be reviewing The Babadook this week, I can reveal. You want to talk about movies that are grounded in reality? Yeah. And both of those movies are freaky as hell. And of course, I'll be reviewing all the other new releases hitting cinemas this October and going through the end of the year. Guys, thank you so much again for your support. And with all that being said, Back Talk, commence.